As you know, this is called the Greater Good Gathering, and there's been a lot of discussion throughout the day of greater good and what that might mean. This is part of a larger effort that I proposed a couple of years ago to Brown University, which most of you know I attended as an undergraduate, and I also taught at Brown several years ago in the public policy program as an adjunct. I've been thinking a lot about public policy, and I wanted to develop a broader concept of public policy because of the direction that I think the world's headed in. And this led to thinking about the creation of what I was calling an Institute for a Greater Good. And the idea was to infuse a concern for the greater good into all the academic disciplines, bring together discoveries and insights from all sorts of different fields, and apply them to a broader conception of the public good and social progress beyond what's generally taught in public policy schools. One thing that's interested me as an example of this is something that comes out of the field of fluid dynamics. This concerns the flow of different kinds of liquids through different sorts of spaces. It's particularly useful in figuring out what to do with the kinks in pipes and how to get them to flow better. And there's all sorts of mathematical equations that have been developed to deal with this. It turns out that the equations in fluid dynamics can be used to model the flow of crowds through public spaces as well. And this has led in recent years to the development of how to design public spaces so that they can be emptied out much more quickly, so that they become safer in an age of terrorism. In similar ways, there are models that have been developed for the spread of diseases that have become applicable to how we understand and can reduce gun violence. There are models of teaching arts and music that turn out to stimulate student achievement in other areas of learning as well. There's a role for basically every discipline that you can think of that occurs up on campus to somehow relate to thinking about and advancing the greater good. That was the original idea behind having an institute on and a gathering about the greater good. The question then, of course, becomes how do you define this greater good? We could get into a lengthy discussion about whether you define things in Benthamite or Rawlsian terms and whether you're interested in average utility versus total utility gains. I've got a simpler definition of and a simpler way to think about what I mean, at least by the greater good. And this is not based on where you fall on the political spectrum. I think most people in this room, particularly Karl Struble, definitely fall at one end of the spectrum. But I think it's possible, and I know plenty of people who do think about the greater good and the public good from all points on the political spectrum. I think that you can be applying the greater good to what you take out of your degree, whether your plan after you leave here is to go to Wall Street or go work in the streets of Calcutta. The question, in my view, is simply whatever you do, whether you apply yourself and whether you care about something that extends beyond yourself, and whether your interest is advancing the good of others than yourself. This is true in single specific ethical instances where you're looking at the welfare of one other person, or as a lifetime pattern as a way of being. That's my simple definition of greater good. Now, putting the interests of somebody else ahead of your own as a one-off thing and a sort of daily basis, making the kind of calculations in the famous trolley problem, involves a lot of complex decision-making, but it's not something that really varies over time and space. We saw the quote from Machiavelli earlier about the kind of universality of the human experience, and that doesn't really vary much from era to era. Making those kind of decisions daily about how are you going to act as an ethical being is largely the same now, despite the fact that we live in a very different social world than existed 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago. But I think that on the other hand, the question of how you advance the greater good in a larger social context, whether you act in all moments in a way that you're living a life that advances a greater good, is something we need to think about very differently today because of changes in the social construct. I mentioned this a little bit last night. When I was a student, when I was the age of you folks here at this front table, except for the two of you, when you talked about wanting to do something to make a change in society and advance the public good, what you were basically talking about was a future in government or law. Now, hardly anybody thinks about things in those terms these days, especially as students, and there's a good reason for that. In my day, it was not that long after the 60s when it was actually possible to imagine a world, and of course a lot of us did imagine a world like this, and this is what attracted us to the law and to public service, where people in politics and people in courtrooms made a huge difference in the world and in the lives of other people. Not long before I came to college, a whole generation of lawyers had really changed the world as part of the civil rights movement. A lot of really courageous politicians, words you don't hear a lot of these days, had stood up, particularly in the United States Senate, and really changed the direction of both this country and this planet. Both by enacting civil rights legislation that, despite the best attempts of some on the Supreme Court these days, still stands and is still making a difference in the direction of this country. But beyond that, there was a serious struggle over not just a particular unjust war, the war in Vietnam, but a larger issue of how this country decides between war and peace, which, despite what you see about the United States on the global stage today, what came out of the 60s in the form of the War Powers Resolution was really a revolution in constitutional law in this country, and it changed how we make decisions to commit the nation to war or to peace in ways that still stand today, despite the fact that every president since then has denied that the war powers is constitutional within the authority of Congress to enact. Every single one of them has in fact complied with the War Powers Act. And in a lot of ways with the president we have today, you can thank God there is a War Powers Act, because to some degree it's going to constrain the decisions that the executive branch makes in the years going forward. So there are ways in which politicians and lawyers made a huge, huge difference in this country. Unfortunately, by the time I had graduated from school and became a lawyer, there was much less point in doing that. The courts had changed dramatically. I've spent most of my life in or around public service, and I think the ability to make a difference in government has changed dramatically. You know, I have started thinking about different ways that one can make a difference and contribute to our society, and I think that those of you who are starting out on your careers today look at things very differently than how we did in my day up on the Hill. As I mentioned, I taught public policy students a little over a half dozen years ago. So these are kids who were self-selecting for interest in careers in public policy. Out of them, there are 2 or 3 that went to law school. There's one who's actually running for office at this very moment. But the bulk of them have gone on to business school, to medical school, advocacy journalism. One of them started a renewable energy business. One of the students that I'm close to has gone and joined a social design firm. One of my students has gone into labor organizing. They found other ways to make a difference besides law and politics, and well, they should. Because the world today is very different from what it was 50 years ago. And the main point of what we were talking about through this whole weekend is the world is going to be even more different 50 years from now. I want to give a couple of examples about this that frame how I think about this and really what we're talking about over the period of this 48 hours. Kalev mentioned earlier about some of the stuff that's going on in Estonia, which I know some of you know about. I've written a couple of things about Estonia and what it's doing, and as a result, the Estonian government asked me to go over there a little over a year ago to meet with most of their top officials who are involved in this really earth-shaking stuff that they're doing around technology and government and public services. They're not only putting all government services online, and one of the results of that was they took me to a DMV, motor vehicle office in Tallinn, and there was nobody there. I mean, nobody other than me and a couple of people waiting behind a counter. Because nobody goes into the DMV to get their business done, because you can do it online. The only people who go to government offices live are people over 80 who can't figure out how to do it all on their cell phone, basically. The entire government, every aspect of government service is online in Estonia. But they're going beyond that, and because essentially the entire government is online, they're more or less exporting their government. They want to provide the best government in the world for business regulation and taxation, and allow you, wherever you live, whoever you are, whether you're Estonian or not, to essentially become a virtual Estonian and do your business regulation and your business taxation through Estonia virtually at a distance. They're essentially transcending what are increasingly becoming outdated notions like territory, location, nationality. These are important trends in the world today. If you don't think so, if you don't realize that, then you don't understand where the Trump phenomenon is coming from either. Trump is not causing what's going on in the world today. Trump is caused by what's causing the world today. And we're seeing a widespread reaction, both in the United States and in Europe particularly, but in other countries as well, against the fact that notions of territoriality and location and nationality are under serious threat today because of technology. And a lot of people are pushing back about that, both because it changes their lives and or because they have trouble with the concept of it. What you're seeing in Estonia is the notion that a government can compete with another government to provide their services the way a business does across jurisdictional lines and compete with other governments for their citizens, essentially. And this isn't just happening in Estonia, and it's not just happening as a result of technology. After I was in Estonia, I went to Scandinavia and spent some time in a couple countries there, but I visited Stockholm. And I wanted to go to Stockholm specifically. This is, well, you know, Carl's going to love this. This is just going to sound odd. I wanted to go to Stockholm because I wanted to meet with the Swedish postal authorities. You know, why? Go ahead, laugh, it's fine. Why would I want to meet with postal authorities? Well, you know, for one thing, I think postal stuff is fascinating for a number of reasons. Just to prove that, I brought to you here, this is some stuff I picked up in Stockholm. This is practically every postage stamp ever issued by the Swedish government for the last 200 years. It's a great souvenir of my trip. In case that's not good enough for you, I just think this is so funky here. They put out this postal card. This is a 3-stamp set of the royal family of Sweden. You know, you can't get that everywhere, folks. But what's actually most interesting to me about the post office is, besides the fact that it's just this odd little thing, it's one of the most consistent aspects of human history that says something about government and government service. And the difference between what's public, what's private, and how that difference shifts over time. Postal service actually goes back to the earliest human governments thousands of years ago. They had postal services, believe it or not. And it was generally originally started as a governmental service, but in almost every case, it was eventually privatized. And that didn't work out so well either, and it then became a public service again. And over the last several thousand years, postal service has gone back and forth from being a publicly provided monopoly to private monopolies, to private competition, to other forms of monopoly and so forth, and back again. This has shifted consistently over time. One aspect of this is that it tends to be a monopoly service, whether it's publicly or privately provided. And the monopoly providers, generally governments, have figured out that as long as they've got this going on, there are other ways to make money off of it. The post, like a lot of government services, but most obviously, more than any other government service, basically functions like what we would say in contemporary terms is a backbone. And once you have the backbone, and everybody's on it because there's really only one backbone, you, and in fact then others, can build apps off of that enable you to capitalize on that, commercialize, and make money. Many of you probably don't know what the biggest bank in the world is. The biggest bank in the world is not Chase Manhattan. It's the Japanese Postal Bank. It's a bank that was an offshoot of the Japanese postal system. There used to be a postal bank in the United States. It was a great source of wealth transfer for immigrants from abroad to send money back to their families and get money here. There are some politicians in the US a couple of years ago started advocating for the same thing. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were both pushing for the creation of a US postal bank, essentially as a way of making capital more available to lower income people. Our Congress will not let the Postal Service make money in all sorts of ways. Because basically they don't want to prove that there's a government institution that can make a profit. It's much handier for some of the arguments we were talking about last night to have the Postal Service be an exemplar that everybody knows of a government that's cratering because it can't make money. It's not because you can't make money on the post, it's because Congress won't let it. So the Postal Service has been trying to figure out a way around this. How can we make money as a government even though we have federal laws that prohibit any part of the government from acting like a business in any fashion? What they've figured out, and this is the thing I really love about postal service as a topic. The USPS has a money-making venture they launched about a year or two ago. They're selling Postal Service branded clothing. All right? Okay, this sounds bizarre, but it's not. There's a real logic to this. What do you know about the Postal Service? It's got a brand. It's got a brand that everybody knows, that no matter what, Neither rain nor snow, nor sleet nor hail, nor dark of night is going to keep them from doing their jobs, right? So if you need all-weather gear that can stand up to rain or snow or sleet or hail, who are you going to call? U.S. Postal Service. They're selling clothes based on that notion and making money from doing it. So this is a matter of commercializing a government brand. Think about that. This is government as business. Now, when I was in Sweden, what most people don't realize, we all think of Sweden as like hot tubs and liberal politics and so forth. But the country, like a lot of the world, took a fairly conservative turn 20 years ago. And they elected a conservative government that started privatizing virtually everything. And they didn't quite privatize the post, but they opened it up to competition. Most places, the Postal Service is a government-mandated monopoly. In Sweden, they opened it up to competition. And this has a couple of interesting ramifications because it turns out there's some things you just can't compete. And ironically enough, it's, the main thing that you can't turn into a competitive, profitable business is service to outlying areas with low population density where everybody's conservative and hates the government. Turns out if they want service, they have to have the government. So that can't be turned into a competitive business. But most of the country's population is centered in one place around Stockholm, and a lot of that can be commercialized and turned into successful businesses. Now, the ironic thing becomes the competitor, the private business that was most successful at competing with the Swedish government for postal delivery was eventually bought out by the Norwegian government. And so, Norway is the next country over. They now own the private company that competes with the Swedish government for Swedish postal delivery in Sweden. And they were so good at doing that and beating out the Swedes for mail delivery in their own country, the Swedes had to compete back. And they figured out, how do you compete back if you've got a bad business model, you're going down the tubes and some competitor is eating your lunch? You merge. And so the Swedish government went to the Danish government and said, we both have terrible postal services. Let's get together and have a really terrible postal service. And they created the first binational postal authority in world history. So there's a corporation that's set up that's owned 50-50 by the two governments. The government, by government-owned corporation competes with a private corporation owned by another government for mail delivery within Sweden. And that's how the Postal Service functions in Sweden. So what we're seeing increasingly is the ability for governments to compete across territorial lines for customers as if they were businesses. Once that happens, there's no reason why a company can't start competing against a government for governmental types of services. And we're not talking about just virtual stuff like Estonia. We're talking about mail delivery, physical location-specific services that are starting to become competitive, government against government, and businesses against government as well. So it's my belief that within 10 years or so, what we're really going to see in terms of government service is that all of us here in this room are going to be able to choose, basically. Things are going to become unbundled. And if you want to get your business regulation from Estonia instead of from the state of Rhode Island, you're going to be able to do that. You can get your mail delivery from Norway. They're apparently pretty good at it. Your health coverage from Canada. Most Americans want Canadian health coverage anyway. You'll be able to get your public pension from Germany. Buy into the German public pension system. Be much better than what we've got. You can get your education. Of course, pretty obviously, higher education is going to be provided online all around the world in the coming years. And the American universities that are moving to the forefront have already figured this out, and they're providing online education. But it's not just going to be higher ed. The state of Florida is already producing online K-12 education and selling it to other states because they're better at it than some other states here. So all of this stuff is transcending jurisdictions. You're going to be able to get government services from anybody that you want to. There are a couple of countries that are moving ahead as the main innovators in cyber defense. They're much better than at other places. Ironically enough, it's smaller countries that have become very tech savvy at this. Chile, the Netherlands, Israel, that's who you're going to be buying your cyber defense from in the future. All of that's happening. When that happens, there's nothing to start a company as opposed to a country from being the provider of your services. So anyway, that's what I see as the future and an increasing part of the future. So what does that mean? It means that the challenge that we're facing in coming years is a world that's increasingly competitive and market-oriented. That's great for lots of things. It's not so great for some things, and we're going to be talking about that for the rest of the afternoon. There are public services that don't readily lend themselves to revenue generation. Most of these are things that we really value as a part of our society. If you're in a revenue-generating, market-driven world, whether those things can survive and be provided in the ways that we're used to and that we want becomes very, very problematic. These things are public goods, which is a technical economic term, although its name carries a closely aligned meaning to the economic meaning. But basically, the economic meaning is these are benefits that can't be confined to those who choose to pay for them. And that's a serious problem in a market economy. So what happens to these things? Public health, educational opportunity, open space, clean air, collective security, income redistribution, fairness, justice. These are all public goods. What happens to them if notions of government that have persisted in virtually every society, one way or another, for the last 2,500 years are suddenly overturned? The technologies that are driving this, that are undermining traditional notions of government, social cohesion, geography, particularly the ability to fence off people within territory and compel their services, compel their support from monopoly services, which is more or less the definition of government. These same technologies also create new opportunities. They're making it easier to aggregate people in larger numbers through platforms like eBay and Airbnb. They're driving down the marginal cost of everything. They're digitizing everything. They're monetizing virtually everything. Those phenomena all go together. And they're allowing people to choose interactions you couldn't have chosen before. That then, as a result of a technology called blockchain, which those of you who know me know I'm absolutely fascinated by, blockchain allows you to choose interactions that then become obligatory and self-enforcing from there. You take all of these developments together, and it's making it easier and easier for the functions we think of as inherently governmental to be carried out by non-governmental entities. In fact, that's what I'm actually trying to do. Was the origin of this conference was a meeting to have discussion for a business model at my house a year ago to talk about how we can be developing it was essentially a for-profit government business model, because I think that's the direction the world's moving. I want to give you some quick examples of this. Uber, we've talked about before. It's obviously a main example of what's going on in the world. Most people think of Uber as undermining the taxi industry. I don't think it's undermining the taxi industry. I think Uber is undermining the regulation industry. In other words, government. Governments are finding harder and harder to regulate companies like Uber and Airbnb, which we all know, but these are creating new forms of regulation that are becoming socially ubiquitous. Because the platform is everywhere and everybody gets to rate everybody's performance, if you provide subpar service on eBay or Airbnb or Uber, it's more problematic, but you're eventually completely shut down on Uber and Airbnb and eBay. You can't not function if you're not rated well by other people. This is part of a larger technology-driven phenomenon in which everything you do is increasingly open to public inspection, judgment, and enforcement. In some ways, this presents a frightening picture to a lot of people of a big brother society in which everything you do, everything you say, it's been captured by cameras that are everywhere, tracking devices, digital transactions. Everything you do is known to somebody, whether it's the government or the Amazon. But it's not just them. This information is available to every single person in the world, as Kalev was demonstrating. So it's not so much Big Brother. We were talking last night, Carl and I, about this becoming an authoritarian world. I think it's actually becoming the opposite of that. It's not a world of Big Brother. It's a world full of little brothers. And in my view, this represents a step back towards an earlier form of social organization. Historians of the nation state will tell you that generally what we believe now is the nation state came into existence not because of I'm blanking on his name. It's Rousseau's social contract theory. They evolved basically as societies got larger and more complex. You reach a certain point when you get beyond like 200 people, you can't self-regulate, so you need to create some other mechanism for regulating people. Small societies don't need that. Right? In the Lacey's sorority, everybody knows what everybody else is doing. So you don't need courts, you don't need the police, you don't need a government. Small societies self-police. It's somewhat claustrophobic. But that's what small towns do, that's what small societies do. You get large enough, you have to have some superstructure that's the state to watch over and coordinate things. What the technology is doing today is moving us back to a village. It's a village of 7 billion busybodies, but it's a village. Okay? That, along with the death of technology, is what is undermining the traditional state. But it's not the privatization of government that's resulting, it's the socialization of government. So all that means in the years ahead, we need to think very differently about notions of common good, public goods, and governments. In other words, we need to look at how technology is changing the ways in which we interact and make choices together as communities or as a society or even as a planet. Traditional governmental structures are becoming attenuated and not so much disappearing as they're facing competition from all sorts of alternatives. I can give you an example of that, and then thankfully for all of you, be wrapping up. But this is an example of where the world's headed that I find absolutely fascinating. There's an organization out there that provides nonprofit social services to people in need. There's another organization you can think of that is a for-profit business that provides affordable housing. So it's for-profit, doing something good. There's a third organization that is a political party. It happens to be a political party that runs its country. It's a governing party, so it's effectively the government of a country. Fourth organization is a terrorist group. Okay. What do these four organizations have in common? They're all the same organization, actually. Hamas. It does all those things. It's a nonprofit, it's a for-profit, it's a government, it's a terrorist organization. Okay? We're living in a world where functional boundaries, all boundaries, are blurring and collapsing. Okay? In that kind of world, how do we advance notions of common good? How will public goods fare in an increasingly marketized world? How can we define new politics of good that goes beyond government? And most importantly for all of us here today, how do each of us individually pursue our commitment to a greater good, something that's bigger than our individual selves, in such a world that's increasingly atomized politically and distributed in a technological sense? Those are the questions that I've been hoping we could address through this conference that we've addressed so far in the governmental context. Now we're going to move on to looking at how you do that beyond government, outside of government, where there's a lot of interesting stuff going on.